Knowing that perhaps there aren't many people in the audience who've read the book, we thought it might be good for Krupa to give us a sense of what it's like by reading a small bit from the start of the book. Krupa, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Supriya. So this part of the book is the second chapter. It's called A Part of Their Home Survives. The first chapter of the book is called A Part of Our Home Dies, which is basically, it begins with my home sort of going underwater while my parents were there and they had to sort of run away elsewhere before the house drowned. So this is the next chapter. It's called A Part of Their Home Survives. We didn't think they'd remember, but they did. They remembered their many homes, every single one they had breathed in before, thrived in. It was as if nothing had changed, as if someone had turned the clock back. Their ancient homes looked different now, but once they started to make their way in, they claimed it as their own again. You see, we had thought of them as but minor obstacles to building a bustling metropolis. We displaced them, disallowed them from entering their own turf, and then we built on top of their homes. They'd been around for as long as time can be, and yet we said there was no place for them in the city. All we saw of them was their struggle for survival, the remnants of their decrepit homes, their unkempt facades, and the endless barrage of mosquitoes they bred, as if to strike vengeance. When we passed by them, we cowed our noses and looked away. Then, when the skies made love to the ocean, and pregnant clouds burst forth with droplets that grew slowly into raging thunderstorms, puddles turned into ponds and then lakes. The floodgates of their memories were thrown wide open. It was time for them to come back to claim our uneven tar roads. With their bodies covered in grime, dark and brown, like syrupy jaggery and molasses. There are three of them that call Chennai their home: the Kosisthalayar, the Kuvam, and the Adyar. Rivers. Their homes survive in their memories, and they showed us its power in December 2015.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you for that introduction to exactly the thing that I think we need to understand about Chennai, as we do about all our major cities and other landscapes, including Goa, which is that all land owes something to the water.
Yeah.
Very briefly, for those of us who aren't familiar with Chennai, can you explain what it means? I mean, everybody knows that Chennai is a coastal city,
right?
But it also has these three rivers
right.
running through what was originally the land, and a system of lakes and
right.
tanks.
Right.
Would you explain that briefly to us?
Basically, Chennai was actually set up as a result of a trade agreement between these East India Company fellows who were looking to set up a factory, and they chose this particular spot of land according to historical documents because it would give them the constant cyclones and the constant waves from the coastline would give them protection from the hordes of thieving horsemen who would come to sort of grab whatever was being made in these factories. So as a location also, they kind of picked something that was a risky before they set up Madras. And then Madras sort of grew. There were already villages that were in existence that came much before Madras, like Mylapore and Triplicane, and what was Georgetown. Even around there were fishermen who were living there for long. So all of these then sort of, the British started to sort of bring all of them together. And there were three rivers that were running through the city, and there's one canal that the British built. And these are the main...
That's the Buckingham Canal.
The Buckingham Canal, which was built during the famine, as a famine relief exercise. So there are three rivers, the Adyar, Kosisthalayar, and Kuvam, and then you have the coastline. So the three rivers are running like this, perpendicular towards the ocean, and then there's a Buckingham Canal that's cutting through this, and there were several tanks and smaller canals and flood receptacles, all of these. The thing is, every single water body in Chennai is connected to each other. Very complex system of drainage, and all of them, so no matter whether we have a tsunami or whether we have a, some ocean high tide rising, or whether we have floods, the entire city is at a risk. It's not just like the people who have a beach view home, or people who live on the banks of rivers will be affected.
Right.
But the city is designed in a way that everybody will go.
Right. And of course, the nature of our cities is such now that they're so full of people,
Right.
that anything that might once upon a time have been a partial disaster actually ends up affecting all of us. Where were you when it started raining that December?
So I was in my home, and which
is
a
in
bit
Tina,
away from. It is in Tina, which is a bit away from the river. But my parents live like a few meters away from the river. And the thing is, until the floods, I didn't realize how close to the river my parents actually.
Right. Because it's not a part of our daily lives.
It's not, and it's basically also a function of caste. So our streets are here, and then beyond there's a sort of a semi-slum, and then there's an actual slum. So the people who are first in the line of disaster are actually like the most marginalized,
Right.
and then the others, and then us. But the intensity of this flood was so much that this time we were forced to confront the fact that we are just as vulnerable as the most marginalized.
Right.
Because usually the water would just simply come into these hutments, and they would all be put in these schools. They'd be given some relief material, and then everybody will come back, they'll clean up, and then they move on with their lives. This has happened at least twice before. Since my parents moved into this home. But this is the first time that my parents lived in an apartment building, which was drowning. And so this is when you start to realize that we're not as safe as we think we are.
One of the many reasons I thought your book was really important was that usually when people write about disasters in our part of the world, they are people who come to us from outside. A great deal of literature on the tsunami, which you mentioned, for example, in English, is generated by people who don't live in these affected areas.
Right.
And so it was important for me, and I think one of the reasons your book had like an extraordinary emotional effect on me was that you were someone to whom the disaster happened.
Right.
And I was reading it as we were having an extraordinary monsoon, as you guys did in Goa. We did in Bombay City as well, not seeing the sun for days, seeing a kind of incessant rain that made us feel like nothing was ever going to change ever again. And that was when it became clear to me that what you're writing about, and you do it very well, is a structural phenomenon, it's a social phenomenon, it's also deeply personal and emotional. Would you mind telling us very briefly about how your family and your friends were affected by, your immediate circle was affected by who do you know who was the worst affected by the floods?
Well, the people who were worst affected were actually the people I sort of researched on for the book.
Right, but before it became a book,
yeah. In my own circle, I'd say my parents were pretty badly hit. That was one of the big reasons for me to even think about all the questions that even are present in the book. That's what became the book, all of my questions, because it starts with my parents. My dad usually has this habit, like most Indian uncles, he likes to sleep on the floor in the summer, whatever. It's always summer in Madras, whether it's December or whatever. He likes to sleep on the floor, and he gets like this wet towel, puts it on himself, and then sleeps on the floor. But that day, he just sort of happened to be sleeping on a bed. And then a neighbor apparently came, knocked on the door at 4 a.m. and said that his house was filling up. And my parents said, my house is not filling up. And it's ridiculous because my parents' house is here and their house is there. Right. So they're saying that, but my house is not filling up. And both my parents are standing there having a conversation with this boy. And then they're suddenly standing in this much water. It's just they blink and then there's this much water. The house is pitch dark. And everything starts to like float. Like your fridge and your washing machine, your cylinder is starting to float. Right. And my parents, who are both over 60, are stuck in this water, which is apparently really slippery. And after the flood left, I sort of discovered about as well is that flood is not water. Okay. Hello. Yeah. So the flood, when it comes to your home, it's not exactly water. It's just sewage, because it comes in through the sewage holes into your home. And flood water does not just come through the streets. It comes through the drains. It comes through your commode. It comes through, like, the worst things that you can imagine happening to your childhood bed, to your mother's cupboard where her saris are kept. All of those things. So, and then so all of these images my mother still tells me, but she's moved on, but I've not been able to, because I think if you are in there as well, somehow your brain is trying to push it back. But after she told me, I've not been able to get those images out of my head. And they had to sort of run upstairs. They had to climb steps as the water was sort of filling up in the building, and then go upstairs. And they had like all these conversations about, there's 25 kilos of rice that will rot if we leave them in the house. Should we leave them? At least let somebody make use of it. Let's get it out. But by this time, the water's already got to the rice. Then my dad is debating if he should lock the door or not. So he doesn't know if he leaves the door closed, if the flood water will drain by itself, because it's the first time we've had a flood.
Right.
So
this is kind of an elite dilemma, right? That so many of us, and you describe this so heartbreakingly in the book, time and again, these questions of, what am I going to lose if I lose this? Well, you're going to lose everything, so just run.
Yeah.
And so many people have to make those heartbreaking decisions.
Absolutely. And then he had to sort of finally, he just sort of closed it, and then he ran upstairs, and then they were just up there stuck because they can't swim. Both my parents can't swim. Some of the people who could sort of started to get into boats, and they started to leave the building, but they can't. So they're just stuck there for 2 days. But this is also,
and you had no way to contact them after a certain point of time.
Absolutely.
Right. Krupa, it's very rare for things that don't happen in Bombay and Delhi to make the national news, or to make the English/Hindi news. But the floods in Chennai were of such severity that at some point they had to cover them even out of the studios in Delhi. What was missing from the narrative that the rest of us might have heard? The rest of us who don't speak Tamil, who don't consume Tamil media, heard about the Chennai floods? Right.
I think this is what Rajdeep Sardesai calls the tyranny of distance, which is that we are so far away from the capital that it's not just us, it's everybody else who's not in Bombay.
I'd call it the laziness of journalism, because distance is what you're supposed to bridge when you're a reporter.
I agree with you. I think one of the things that got really missed out that I wanted to really focus on was the aftermath of the floods, actually, and how even in the face of such a big disaster, we were not able to transcend things like caste, and how it was easier for the heartwarming story to sort of turn into memes, and then they were all over the news. Those are also our stories, but these are also our stories. That fact that people were stopping aid from reaching poorer villages. Like people had to fight for the most basic things. My aunt is a principal at a Adi Dravida school, and she called me and she said that there were children who were without clothes for almost a month after the floods had happened.
This is in a village outside Chennai.
Yes. And so even within that, you see the tyranny of distance, because Chennai, if you say Chennai, South Madras, which is where all the posh people live, the Brahmins live, all of these parts got lots of news coverage. But there is a North Madras, there is a northern part of Chennai where the working class lives. That's where everybody who eventually cleaned the city and brought it back to life after the floods live. They were also flooded, but their plight was not covered. They said, one of the fishermen told me, who had been part of the rescue mission, he told me that he was sitting in his house in knee-deep water and watching a news piece about somebody in South Madras and how they had been affected much after the flood had receded. These guys, there was water stagnating in their part of town for much longer.
Right.
And none of that was really sort of covered. And so it's a very complicated issue.
And of course, this was a problem within Brahminical Tamil media as much as...
But I wouldn't say the Tamil media isn't... I wouldn't say that it's... Tamil media is actually... News media is actually among the better regional news media. But even... then I think it's also a question of who you're catering to.
Correct.
Who's watching your news,
Right.
and which
Who's
news?
buying your advertising?
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
news sells and all of that. So
Yeah.
I think that it's more a function of I don't know what, maybe invisibilizing.
Mm.
Uh,
So tell us about your own process. Clearly, you traveled great distances emotionally, intellectually while working on this book. Tell us a little bit about your process of uncovering these stories, of discovering these stories from the margins,
right.
and so on.
I would say that I worked on this book for about 3.5 years, and I would say every single problem, I had like all these questions, which is what became the book, and every single question led to like me wanting to bang my head against a wall, because there was an answer for why something had gone wrong, and that answer was always either the state or the administration or the missionary, like a complete collapse of the state machinery. So climate was there, the weather was bad, there was very bad rain, everything was given. But beyond all of this, there were a lot of things that were working to make this as bad as possible, in the sense that it need not have been such a catastrophic event at all.
Right.
And that was the most frustrating for me. So for me, every day there were days when I had to it sounds depressing now, even dramatic, but I would have to cry myself to sleep, because it would just be ridiculous, the kind of loss of life that we've had. Like, for instance, we still don't know how many people died. Some journalists tell me off the record that 500 people died in the floods, but officially I have an RTI answer that says 38 people died. It's ridiculous. I know somebody who told me that they opened their garage and there were 30 bodies pulled into their garage.
My goodness.
Right? But here you have the state saying that, just 38 people died and all in the entire floods. But it's ridiculous. So these are the kind of, uncovering all of this was sort of really a big shock, because in Tamil Nadu we sort of really pride ourselves in the fact that our IAS cadre is supposed to be the best in the country.
That's right.
The state is compared to the Scandinavian states, and we're all like, oh, we're a welfare state, we do so much, but it's all, I think it's sort of, we're not there anymore.
And do you think that, so one clearly, Rivers Remember is a story about institutional failure, both in prevention and to a great degree in how it dealt with the aftermath. One of the things I can think of is that, of course, the state is blind and sees only what it wants to see. The second thing is that, as your book tells us, even one of the most professional cadres in the country has no idea how to respond to disaster.
Yep.
And this has been true since the tsunami. We've had floods in Bombay. Other natural disasters have taken place. So did it feel like it was confirming your worst impressions? Or did it go beyond that to?
I would say it went beyond, because I thought that in Tamil Nadu the general sense is that the officers responded way better to tsunami than they did to the floods, and that there was a much better sort of organization, and also because the tsunami was in a sense not man-made like the flood was.
Right.
It came suddenly, but they felt like it was organized. The relief was sort of organized a little better. But that was before social media. That was when the state could really control what news could trickle down.
Absolutely.
So we don't know. This is just what we remember. We remember that it was great, but we don't know if it was really great. But when I went in to look for how the state responded to the floods, it was utterly shocking. It was officers had gone home, and they didn't know that this was going to happen. Like, these are senior police commissioners who had gone home and sent all of their guys home, and they had no way to reach their own constables to go and ask people to evacuate.
Right. Was the problem that there were no such plans in place, or that these plans were there but nobody paid attention to them?
There was no plans. There was no contingency plan, A, B, C, nothing. There was no inkling of what to do, and they lied in their official response to the CAG, saying that there were centralized war rooms set up or whatever. There was no war room. There was literally people looking up on Twitter saying that, oh, this person is stranded somewhere, and that person will call up Anil Srinivasan, who's a pianist, was very, very famous. He had 18 people in one room manning a phone and calling up the army and navy and asking them to go somewhere to rescue people.
Right. So one of the things, thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things that I think everyone outside Chennai got intensely familiar with in the days of the flooding was the extraordinary civic response that Vivek mentioned.
Right.
The hashtag Chennai Rains, the volunteer groups that got together to to do what they could for relief efforts, became kind of a national byword. Does your book cover that sort of the human response?
Absolutely, it does. And it's actually one of my favorite parts of the book was uncovering this story, which hadn't made it out, unfortunately, until I wrote about it, was how the Sri Lankan refugees who are in Tamil Nadu came out and sort of rescued and helped rehabilitate so many people. This was perhaps the only time in the world that refugees have come out of their the second time, because they did this for tsunami as well.
Right.
And they came out and they sort of helped in volunteering and rescue work, and they sort of worked and gave up a lot of their own time and money and labor towards rehabilitating people who were affected by the floods.
And of course there are layers to that story, right? Because the story of how Sri Lankan refugees come to be and the way they survive in Tamil Nadu and in Chennai is also a story that then forms the background of what you say. So clearly, extraordinary stories of human responses. There are some institutional layers though that work, and one of the things that's extremely heartening to me is to see how civic organizations that may be attached to the government but aren't necessarily bureaucratic respond, especially when it comes to collecting data and so on and so forth. Is Chennai unique in the nature of in the vibrancy of the advocacy organizations and the kind of the environmental research that goes on there?
I think
can you perhaps introduce that to our listeners a bit?
Yeah. So some of the organizations that sort of collected a lot. They'd done their own audit after the floods, and they'd sort of. And that data sort of became really important for me for the book. And Offer is one of these organizations which works with. Offer is an organization for Elam refugees, the Tamil refugees who are in Tamil Nadu, and they're the only organization who are allowed to work with the refugees. Not even the government of Tamil Nadu goes in there, and because it's an organization set up by and for the refugees, and they work with the rural poor communities in Tamil Nadu and give them and help them to sort of come up and all of that. And Offer had done great work, and there's one more called Bhumi, which so they had set up an entire wedding hall as a sort of a relief center. They had taken it on, and they had reached out to the most interior spaces where aid was not going in, and they'd helped my aunt as well in her school with the rations and all of that. So there were some organizations that sort of really rose to the occasion, and we were really sort of saved by them, and thanks to them. Because the thing that NGOs can do that individual volunteers cannot do is basically when aid would go to one of these, some of these Dalit villages, the caste Hindus would stop the aid and would try to ransack whatever was being sent to them. And the thing that the NGOs were able to do is they know which areas are sensitive, and then they would inform the police, and they would go with the police so the aid would actually reach in time. Right. And they would actually go to a village and do a recce of how many people are there, and then they would list them like the family that has a baby would get the most preference, then the family with the elderly, then the family with the disabled, and then the regular people, because they know that otherwise the well-built men can outdo anybody in reaching out for aid.
That's right.
So these are little things, these are the kind of things where organizations come in handy, and I was really grateful to know that there were people who had thought this much, and they were doing this, and that the organization of refugees had thought of all this, because who better than them
to know that is indeed one of the more extraordinary aspects of the book. Okay, let me abstract and go away from like the material of the book. What is it like for you, a reporter, to kind of make the leap to writing a work of book length non-fiction? Difficult.
It is.
Tell us about the process of trying and failing and succeeding.
Yeah, so the easy bit was actually, for me, funnily enough, easy and most emotionally difficult was the first chapter, which is the personal chapter. Because I'd been trying to write fiction for a while, and by then I'd sort of also done some amount of creative writing and workshopping and all of that. So that was actually easy for me. But despite being a journalist for all these years, but I'd largely been an art and culture kind of a journalist. So for me to process this much difficult information and then to just sort of translate it into a book was a huge sort of drain emotionally. It's actually heartbreaking, and I was very aware of the fact that I was inflicting a heartbreaking book on people, and there was no, oh la la la, we're all going to be fine, because we're not going to be fine. And that was the sense I got while I was working on this book.
Right.
And I didn't want to have like a false sense of an ending where everything is fine. So that sort of was the most, I would say, the difficult part of writing the book, which is to come to terms with the fact that we live in a very difficult time, and that yes, it's great that there are lots of people doing lots of good work, but I think the gravity of the situation hasn't really hit a large number of people yet as to how things can go wrong like that. All it took was one night of heavy rains. And then you can just... So I watched this movie recently. It's an anime movie, Japanese anime movie called Weathering With You by Makoto Shinkai. It's a brilliant movie. And he's one of my favorite filmmakers as well. So I went to watch the movie, and I was watching this movie, and then it was like being in Madras during the floods. Because there's a scene in which Tokyo, it's just relentlessly raining in Tokyo, and then you see the city just sort of fill up. And that's exactly what happened to us. And then this is when we realize everybody else is also sort of grappling with this, right? What will you do if it does not stop raining and you don't have a good administration that understands how to manage water in a reservoir?
Right. And social fissures of the kind that you describe, in which inequality plays such a role in who has access to safety, survival, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And one of the things about Rivers Remember is that it also moves away from disaster literature, in that there is a strain of how we write about disasters in which we search relentlessly for altruism, for a kind of human triumph. And I personally think that's very valuable, having lived in a city that has had, and lived in a city through a time where we had like bombing, a gun attack, floods kind of consecutively. It became very important for me to believe in the goodness of people and how they respond in the aftermath of a tragedy. All of which very much happens in Chennai as well and is documented by Krupa. But that Rivers Remember, her book resolutely avoids as a kind of all-encompassing conclusion. Why not? I mean, do we move away from the idea that we're all going to save each other no matter what happens?
I think the tragedy is that we're not all going to save each other. We're not going to be able to.
Right.
And even then, we all come with biases. Who are you going to save first? Your own people, whoever you think your own people are, because there are too many people out there. And then we're all products of our class and our caste, and there's only our inability to understand the other. All of this will play especially nastily during a catastrophe. That's what I realized. We may never admit it. We may never admit that we have some quality of all of this in us, but it's there and it comes out during catastrophes. And so for me, it was impossible to write a story that was about the human triumph when it was not. It was not a story of triumph. The triumph was only like a footnote, I would say.
Right.
And the real story was what happened before and after. That's what the book sort of really is about. That there was too much noise about how people came out and helped each other, but there was very little about who people chose to not help, who died, who didn't have access, and all of that.
Right.
So.
And about accountability, which in the end, remains resolutely like it's something. It's like the heartbeat of the book. Right. We have to stand up and take and take accountability socially, institutionally, and politically.
Right.
Before I open it up to the audience, I want to ask you, disasters are never finite.
Right.
There are people, entire societies for which they are ongoing forever.
Right.
Who are the people in Chennai for whom in 2019 the floods are still ongoing, are still marking their lives?
Oh, absolutely. I would say it's the marginalized who are actually not spoken about. Even in my own book, for me, I was able to only focus on Chennai, but there were also Kadalur and Kanchipuram, all these other districts where there were weavers, potters, farmers, the landless laborers who have been unable to move on. These are people who've gone back in their lives by almost a decade because they've lost their tools of trade, they've lost their fiber boards, they've lost their only source of livelihood, they've lost whatever money they have saved. So they've literally gone back by a decade, and it's going to take them a long time to come out. Even now, there are people who still don't have a house. People don't know, because the flood comes and goes, you don't know which exactly your land is, right? The pond has moved, and then whatever you've cultivated is gone. They call it silting or something, I can't remember the name, sand casting, that's what it's called. So the sand sort of comes and overtakes the land, and they're not able to figure out where their land ends and where their neighbor's land begins. These are huge administrative issues that take, you have to depend on the collector and you have to depend on the tahsildar to come and sort of help you out. And so these are the people who I would say are still sort of bearing the. People who are in the city have moved on. Even the marginalized who are in the city have moved on. But even among them, the people who lived closest to the river have all been just thrown out of the city to some faraway place where they have to travel almost 2.5 hours to reach their place of work. And so again, who gets to be thrown out? Who gets to stay? Have the Lakeview apartment. That's also a part of the political question.
If there's anyone in the audience who has questions, we'd love to hear from you. We're in Goa, a state that has suffered greatly from floods this year. And if you want to talk briefly about that, we'd be happy to hear from you as well. The first question to Dilip, because he has his hand up and also because he has cats on his shirt.
You noticed the cat. Did you notice the little golden eyes? Look, Krupa, you just talked a little bit earlier about the response of the community as opposed to the response of the authorities. So this is, I traveled in Orissa after the cyclone in 1999, the Gujarat earthquake in 2001, the floods in Bombay in 2005, maybe Supriya, you remember that? The tsunami in 2004, even in New Orleans after Katrina. This is a consistent refrain that the community efforts are always much more of course in quantity, quality, and the government authorities are never able to match that. So what's going on? Why is the establishment always unable to rise to this challenge?
And can we change?
Right. I think change is possible, but before that, why I think it's simply because, like I said, the administration is also made up of people who come with their own inherent biases, and they must be under intense political pressure to cater to the elite. So in my own colony, like for instance where my parents stay, they said there were rumors just after the night of the floods that, I don't know how the rumor got to them because there was no WhatsApp then, but none of their phones were working, but they heard the rumor all right. They heard that in the middle of the night, IAS officers, because it's a kind of a, whatever, posh locality. My parents live in the apartment building, but there are a lot of these bungalows that are where these babus live. And somebody said that they heard, cars with the sirens leaving the place just before it flooded. How did those guys know? How did they leave? And my parents didn't. They lost everything. So I think that could be one reason. The change, I think, can actually come from our administration finally admitting that they can't do it by themselves, and that they have to activate some form of a civic response in terms of whenever a disaster happens, and then go ahead and equip the community to sort of respond to a catastrophe when it should happen. Instead of saying no flood happened, which is what the Tamil Nadu government continues to maintain, instead of saying no flood happened, you're all fine, nobody died, accepting the fact that yes, flood happened, it could happen again, here's how you deal with this. Right? Become facilitators instead of being in denial. I think.
I'm sorry, hi. I haven't read your book, so it's not a judgment or anything on my part, but you mentioned the tyranny of distance, and my issue is that we only get affected when we are desensitized to any information that comes when it doesn't affect us directly. And my thinking is that you said yourself that there were floods before and only the people on the marginal people got affected. Why is there not things done at that time? Why only when the rich people are involved that things get done?
Absolutely. Okay. This is one of, this is at the core of my book. This is a question I struggle to answer. And I actually mentioned this exact thing in the book, that marginalized were affected. But this time it was different because flood was no longer something that happened to someone else in the news. So the whole point of me trying to write this book is for the others who may have never experienced the flood to sort of understand what a flood is like, what can happen to you and everything you hold dear and precious. I can no longer go and lie down in the bed I grew up in. I can no longer, hold a sari. There's like this favorite cotton sari of my mother's that I used to like to sort of snuggle into on a winter's night, but I can no longer do all of that because it was all lost to the floods. And these are stories we don't get to hear. And when we think of flood, we think of water coming, but nobody had prepared me for the fact that it was actually just sewage that flows through your house, and we couldn't live in our house for almost months after the flood had come and gone. And but there are marginalized who don't have the luxury of going elsewhere, so they have to continue to live in that. So this was me exactly, trying to come to terms with this distance that I feel when somebody else is affected by it as opposed to it happening to me. You're absolutely right in your observation.
Vivek, do we have time for more questions, or are you going to play us out?
Thank you very much for that outstanding session. Krupa GE's book, thank you for writing it. It's a very important book. In the